What it is doing is putting the entire industry, not just the tech industry, but the entire stock market at the brink, of a collapse or a bust.
On an individual level, though, there are some arguments that AI can potentially even ruin person's productivity.
You end up actually becoming not only unproductive, but potentially not fit for the world of work.
There's a VC like Vinod Khosla who claims that universities are dead.
If these kids become very facile at using AI to do the work for them, they will not develop necessary skills, necessary cognitive functions, necessary social skills, and problem-solving skills, and we will end up with people who are, who don't have intelligence. The US and China collectively make up a little over 50% of the global digital GDP.
If you're ready to make that 1 degree shift towards massive transformation, then hit that subscribe button and join the MetaSelf community, because sometimes one idea is all that takes for a breakthrough. All right. Thanks so much for joining Dr. Chakravorti. It's a pleasure to have you with me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Lucine.
Talking about the big I think some of the things that you've talked about before is how worried you are about the use of big AI. So, for example, if we talk about applications like ChatGPT, and I read recently a very interesting stat about ChatGPT that 70% of users use it for personal purposes and specifically asking questions such as, and one of the most famous questions was, can you help me plan a vacation? And I remember that you mentioned in one of your conversations that is very worrisome for you. Could you tell me and share why are you worried about that specific use of ChatGPT?
Well, I just to kind of respond to your question, I'm not that worried about people asking ChatGPT, what do I do for my vacation? Or lots of other ways in which people use it, primarily as a personal assistant. That is the single biggest sort of category of use on the parts of regular individuals like you and me. My primary issue is that we are putting a massive amount of investment in developing these foundation models, a massive amount of investment in building out AI infrastructure, and that incurs costs not only in financial terms, it is also driving up the stock market, to levels that seem rather inflated, given that most of these companies that are developing these models don't see a revenue stream anywhere in the near future that can justify this level of investment. So what it is doing is putting the entire industry, not just the tech industry, but the entire stock market at the brink, of a collapse or a bust. So that could be pretty dangerous, just given the dominance of tech stocks in the stock market and the significant amount of households that have invested in the equity market. So this could have a pretty serious impact on households across the income ladder, all over the United States and all over the world. So that's kind of one major source of concern, in addition to the massive amounts of money that is being directed towards it and potentially redirected away from other valuable uses. A third concern is just the build out of AI infrastructure involves building these massive data centers that seem to be popping up everywhere. And they have added costs, not just as being potentially bad neighbors to people who live in those areas, but also competing for water and energy, from the people who live in those areas. So, and I can keep going, just thinking about these AI models. To date, they are not perfect. They have, lots of issues with them. They can hallucinate. They have problems in terms of holes and biases in the data. They could be manipulated and misused by ordinary individuals, and we don't have any guardrails in place, and we don't have a regulatory system in place. So I have absolutely no problems with people using ChatGPT and other such tools for what might seem like relatively light purposes. It is just the question of at what cost. And this cost seems to be insanely high.
And I think another question pops up here about productivity, and that there basically, I think you mentioned in one of your conversations that the productivity gains are incremental. And similarly, for example, Dara Nasimoglu also mentioned that it's around annual productivity increases around 0.5%, which is really small compared to what technologies are telling us. So, what is this interesting, your opinion, to find out your opinion? What is this um, divide between opinions of technologists and economists, and who do you side with more?
I think, this is where it gets into a bit of a tricky game, which is how does one measure productivity? There are sort of standard measures of worker productivity, which productivity, in other words, how much output can you produce from, one unit of, work input. And those standard measures, if you apply them to not necessarily AI per se, but to its precursor, the internet, the history of uh, the internet's contribution to productivity isn't great because there was an expectation that the introduction of the internet and all the descendants of the internet, the World Wide Web and social media platforms and everything else that came after that would lead to a spike in worker productivity, and it did not. In fact, when people first started going online, the growth of productivity actually dropped in the United States. So I think the challenge there is that for one, the measures of productivity themselves potentially are questionable because you are not necessarily picking up, the different ways in which people use these technology tools and thereby to change what they do. And some of that is not being captured by the data. For instance, a large part of productivity measurement, translate is determined on the basis of what contributes to GDP. Now, if you are using, say, GPS to go from point A to point B, it may not necessarily contribute to increased GDP. So a technologist could argue you have become more efficient at going from point A to point B. It's just that it hasn't been picked up by the productivity statistic. So that's kind of one issue. Another issue is that for these tools to truly translate into productivity, it takes time. It takes other complementary developments in the rest of the ecosystem. And we have seen over time, some of those changes sort of come about in the case of the internet. So I think it's the same argument would apply here with the AI tools, which is the productivity measures will not capture the benefits to somebody who has put in a prompt that says, ChatGPT, please help me map my, figure out my vacation. That doesn't necessarily contribute to GDP, so it's not picking up everything. And the second aspect of this is as we keep prompting AI for a variety of different uses, it should start showing up in the GDP numbers. And that takes time and that takes other systems to fall into place.
But essentially, do you think that there will be productivity revolution,
Oh,
or
I have
it's
no
just
doubt that it's going to have an impact on productivity for multiple reasons. Because any user who's paired with AI will be able to get more done in the same period of time. Whether that more done involves certain kinds of functions that are along the lines of writing text or producing graphics or interacting with customers. AI can be definitely a complement to the work that they do, so it does enhance their work. At the same time, it could potentially be a substitute for the work that other people do. So I might need fewer people to do the same work. And that also gives a boost to productivity because the remaining workers now become more, better contributors to the overall output. So I have no doubt that this is going to be a productivity boost. The big question is by how much, and that's where we have a wide range of projections. And the natural question that one needs to ask is, how are people actually making these projections? It's a little opaque as to how one reaches a number 0.5% or 10%. And we've seen how an entire continuum of productivity numbers that people have come up with. And some of them are kind of based on back of the envelope assumptions, and one could debate whether those assumptions are valid or not. So the bottom line is, yes, I do think it's going to contribute to productivity. I simply don't want to put a number against it.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. And on an individual level, though, there are some arguments that AI can potentially even ruin person's productivity. There's a study from MIT that came out and talked about how it's basically offloading your brain to ChatGPT is definitely not a good idea. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's a very, very important issue to keep in mind, which is that the same worker who is using ChatGPT to augment their work over the course of that augmentation, the worker is potentially becoming less and less skilled at kind of the whole of the work that's being done because a large part of it is being done by the machine. So over time, what could argue that the workers' cognitive abilities themselves go into decline because they haven't been doing the work themselves. Now, for adults, that may be one source of concern, and one could argue that it's okay. People don't necessarily know how to, they don't memorize multiplication tables anymore, and we go to supermarkets where people use, the cash register to do the math for them, and they're perfectly fine in terms of being able to run people's groceries, through the cash register. So what's the problem? So it all depends on whom we are talking about in terms of the user of AI. The community or the part of the population that I worry about the most are younger people, whether they are in school or they're in college. If they do this form of cognitive offloading, where basically they rely on the AI to do their homework, the AI to do the reasoning behind some kind of an assignment that they've got, the AI to produce papers and graphics and so on and so forth, and they haven't done the work themselves, they will not be learning. And when they don't learn, you end up actually becoming not only unproductive, but potentially not fit for the world of work. And we are beginning to see signs of that around the corner because it is so easy now for young people, whether you're in school or college, to turn to these AI models for doing much of their work. And as that becomes prevalent, there's definitely something for us to worry about. In the meantime, the teachers themselves have not been able to catch up, and the teachers themselves struggle with both using AI, but also being able to figure out how to integrate AI into their pedagogical approaches.
hmm And as a dean at Fletcher yourself, what have been your observations of seeing how AI is being used by the students? How has that changed the education process?
We are still in the middle of this transition everywhere, not just at Fletcher. In every education institution, my colleagues are still trying to sort through how much AI they permit in both in the classroom and outside it. There are some colleagues who have a strict ban on using AI tools for anything, and I would argue that that is not necessarily a good solution. For one, it's very difficult to police that. But more importantly, AI is going to be a very important tool for people to not only become familiar with, they should also be skilled at it because workplaces are going to demand that. So we should be training young people to use AI as a tool, and at the same time, not offload their thinking to the AI. And that's a very delicate balance. And we haven't found the right balance at Fletcher. And frankly, I don't think we found the right balance anywhere. And we're all trying out a few different ways in which we are allowing students to use AI at the appropriate moments, and then creating structures so that they are not using it for actual reasoning and critical thinking and analysis. And to some extent, we rely on kind of an honor code as opposed to explicit policing. And as we know, honor codes are only as good as people's good intentions. So this is a challenge everywhere. Of course, at Fletcher, we are a graduate school, and people have already been through a series of institutions and exposures that has developed a certain foundation of critical thinking skills. I think the biggest challenges are going to be in elementary school and in particular in middle school. And having talked to educators, I haven't got satisfactory answers about how they are striking the balance at their end.
And some might argue that universities and colleges are going to be obsolete in the next 10 to 20 years. There's a VC like Vinod Khosla who claims that universities are dead. And then there's also a study that says that 70% of Gen Zs, or not 70, less than that, I think around 50% of Gen Zs think that they don't need college degrees anymore because they can just use AI. What is your stance on that, and how worried are you about the future of education in that respect?
Well, I don't think universities or education institutions are going away anywhere. Universities exist not simply for the purposes of helping you of administering a test and getting you answered the test and giving you grades. That's not the only thing that universities do. There is a lot of value to universities as a place to learn, as a place to do independent thinking, as a place to be, a problem solver, and a place to do that not just by yourself, but in the community of others. And of course, beyond all of that, there is a social life to university, which makes you a member of society who can be a responsible contributor, but also someone who has fun. Now, AI is not going to do all of that. So I think the death of fill in the blanks, whether it's universities or other things, have been announced many, many times before. And here we are. We still have all these institutions still standing. So, having said that, do universities need to be concerned? Do universities need to get caught up with how to integrate AI into their approaches? Absolutely. And finally, are universities right on top of it and know exactly how they're going to do it? No, but I think that just is part of every transition. So, we've had a calculator that showed up, many years back. We had spreadsheets that showed up a few years after that. We've had the internet, so they've been, general purpose tools that have showed up in the past, which, prior to that, people used to do a lot of calculations themselves. And it didn't mean that the universities became less relevant. In fact, universities became more relevant because you started doing more complex kinds of calculations in classrooms and elsewhere. So, this is an argument that has been made over and over again, the death of universities, because there's some knowledge related tool that comes out. A university is not going to die.
Another interesting thing that I want to pivot towards is trust. You talked about this in the conversation at the World Bank, and I found it super fascinating that developed countries, specifically US, Australia, and I think there's a number that is around 32% of populations in those countries are trusting AI tools. And then there is developing countries, which I think in some countries, it's around 70% trust in AI tools. And I want to understand this difference. Why is there such divergence in that in trust towards AI?
Yeah, so I think this is an excellent question to ponder because trust is so critical to adoption. And one of the challenges that the AI industry right now has is that people are adopting it very fast, but very few people are paying for it. So trust is important not just for crossing that adoption chasm, but also to get into the paid adoption chasm, get past the paid adoption chasm. And trust itself is a complicated notion. And there are many ways in which people will express their definition of trust. So I'm not going to try and, go into the, differences between, different forms of definitions of trust. But, instinctively, we kind of all sort of have in our minds what we mean by trust. And I also say that one figures out what trust is when it is missing,
Mhm.
because I have a much better way to define distrust, which is I'm uncomfortable with using the technology for X, Y, and Z. That's an expression of distrust. So that's the inverse of trust. Now, the interesting thing, which you just mentioned, is this gap between the developed world and the developing world. The developed world is far less trusting than the developing world. By a factor of 30% to 70%. The US and Canada, the levels of trust, according to one study, is in the 30s, and in India and Nigeria, the number is in the 70s. Now, how do we account for that? Well, there are different ways to provide an explanation, and the way that I find credible is that societies like US and Canada, they are digitally more evolved society. So
Mhm.
they've had, and this is, based on a digital evolution index that we have created at Fletcher. And the United States, in fact, is the most highly evolved digital society of 125 countries that we study. So when you have that degree of exposure to a particular technology, you have become not only relatively more comfortable with the use of the technology, and it's become more integrated into a day-to-day life. You also become more sophisticated as a user of a piece of technology that has been around in your in your consciousness for a long time. If the technology is relatively new to you, and if the alternatives to the technology are very weak and either problematic or non-existent, then I will tend to trust that a lot more. And that's a phenomenon that we've seen play out in a variety of different digital technologies. And poorer countries, the technologies are less evolved, and people are more enthusiastic about embracing them, relatively more unquestioning about the technology, and also because the substitutes for the technology are weaker. So if I'm looking for some information, I can enter that information on, say, a Google search bar or in the prompt bar for an AI model, and I get a response. Now, for a lot of, say, young people in Nigeria or India, I may not have a good alternative to that.
Mhm.
Whereas in the developed world, there are many more alternatives, and people are much more used to, doing this thing. So over time, they begin to appreciate the fact that the responses that I get from these machines are not perfect and sometimes actually
Mhm.
quite misleading. So I
Mhm.
trust them less in the US, and I trust them more in a Nigeria or in India.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I also thought about this from my perspective is probably because there's the adoption rates are higher in developed world and they've tried and tested the tool and seen the hallucinations and what it can and can't do. And then thinking about the regulation and lack of thereof probably gets you a bit of a darker, gloomier picture versus when you haven't adopted the tool yet. You don't really see all the also negative externalities of it as
Yeah.
well.
And there's this kind of one, exactly as you said, there's one more factor which is also useful to keep in mind, which is much of the developing world is demographically is younger than the developed world. And younger people tend to be more trusting because they also feel they're somewhat more facile in the usage of the technology. Whereas older people are, again, I'm using a broad brush approach, but on average, they are more skeptical and also have difficulty in adapting to the technology.
Another thing that I wanted to touch base on quickly is that I found fascinating in your research is the digital state map. I'm not sure if that's the correct title of it, but essentially it's a map of 125 countries that account for 90% of all entire digital activity in the world. And then on one axis, you have basically the digital state. So if I'm not mistaken, it's the maturity. And then on the other axis, you have the momentum, which is how fast countries are moving from physical to digital. And I found it fascinating because looking at it, at the four quadrants of it, on the left upper corner, you have the stall out countries, so to speak. And what I found fascinating there, you could see a lot of the European countries like France, Germany, I think Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. And it's interesting for me to get your opinion on why do you think countries that are so digitally mature have lost momentum, so to speak?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, there are, of all the countries we study 125 countries. They display, different levels of uh, state of digital evolution and the rate of change of that digital evolution. And the stall out countries in particular are largely developed countries that have reached a very high level of evolution because, they are richer and they've been, using digital technologies for longer. And because of that, maturity of the presence and usage of digital technologies, they haven't necessarily been able to keep up with ongoing innovations in the technology. Because what you have to do is to keep the momentum going. One of the biggest drivers of digital momentum is demand generation. And how do you keep generating demand for new applications and new uses of the digital technology. That gets harder and harder as you are, getting more and more mature in terms of the presence of the technology. So you have to really lean into the innovation engine and invest in it in order to keep the momentum going. So much of Western Europe, kind of northern Western Europe, is in that category of stall out countries that have reached that very high level of maturity, but have not been able to combine that with a growth in new applications, new startups, new forms of innovation. Whereas there are other countries, in different parts of the world, and actually in Europe as well. See countries like Estonia or Latvia. They are in Europe, but what they have done is they have not only reached a pretty high level of digital evolution, but they have constantly generated the ability to keep innovating and use their relatively small status in order to become hubs for a variety of different forms of usage of digital technologies. And then you have countries like the United States, which has been an innovation powerhouse, and also because of the massive amount of investment that we've been making in AI in the United States. The US tends to be in the category of countries that are highly evolved, but also with a high degree of digital momentum. So those are the countries that we call the standout countries, high
Yeah.
state and high rate. The stall out countries are high state but lower rate. And uh,
Hmm.
and Europe, interestingly, is sort of following three different speeds. There are, obviously the, kind of the classic Western and Northern European countries, which includes the Germanys, the Frances, the Scandinavian countries in that stall out category. Then you have these smaller, many of them, post-Soviet bloc countries such as Estonia and Latvia that are in the standout space, high rate and high state. And then there are, other countries, primarily in Eastern Europe, that like Bulgaria and Poland, that still haven't reached that level of digital evolution. They have plenty of headroom for growth, and they're growing very fast. So Europe is actually not one monolithic creature. It has, three different sub-elements to it.
Talking about the same map, I'm interested to find out. Obviously, you talked about the US and China, who seem to be leading on the map, and one on digital maturity, the other on digital momentum. And what I want to understand is what does this divergence tell us about the future of the balance of technological power, if you can give us any predictions on that?
Well, I'm just trying to understand, because the question it's a, it's a bit conceptual. So if we think about balance of technological power, of the two leading countries on our map, the United States leads the world in the state of digital evolution, and China leads the world in the rate of digital evolution. We've also calculated the digital GDPs of all these countries that we study. In other words, how much of the economy can be explained by the digital part of the economy. And the US and China collectively make up a little over 50% of the global digital GDP, which suggests that these two countries are essentially not only in a race, but they are also collectively the weight of the global digital economy. And one could argue that perhaps the balance of power entirely rests with these two. And it's important that these two, whatever they're doing, will shape the nature of digital technologies, all over the world. That said, they are not alone. There are lots of other countries in the mix, and even if they're smaller, they play important roles, and those roles could have some powerful influences. So, for example, if we take a country like Singapore, or a country like the UAE, or even a country like Ireland, all of them are exemplars of using digital technology in very innovative ways, and largely because they have they have created policies and an innovation ecosystem designed to create a digital hub in their country. I think it's really important to watch the spaces that are in each of these four quadrants. The standout quadrant countries, which are strong in both rate and state, they play an enormously important role. The US and China being, two out of those several countries there. Their investments, particularly in AI, are going to drive, the future of AI around the world. Then you have countries in the stall-out zone, like the Western and Northern European countries, that have actually put a lot of institutional frameworks and policies and regulations in place. And that has an important influence on
Yeah.
essentially creating a set of standards and guardrails, not only for the European region, but also potentially with impact on the state of technologies around the world. Because there's, what's often called the Brussels effect, where regulations are set in the EU, and companies that are global essentially maintain those same standards and regulations, no matter which market they're in, unless the market pushes back on those regulations and asks you to change them. So those countries also play an important role. And of course, the breakout countries are enormously important because they have very high momentum. They have a lot of innovative aspects to them. And many of those countries are in the developing world. They
Yeah.
are also countries that have gone mobile first, as in using the phone as the primary way in which they are plugging into the internet and using the application. So that creates a whole new class of digital innovations that are optimized for mobile. And that's a very important contribution of these breakout countries. So the balance of power is, on the surface, looks ridiculously simple. It's just the US and China, but in reality, it is far more complex and much more nuanced.
And last on this, in the quadrant of the breakout countries, which some of the countries include Armenia, which is where I'm from, and I was happy to see it on the map, Kazakhstan, Bulgaria, Georgia, and those countries, they have gained high momentum, but they're still lower on the state of digital. And what I want to understand is gaining this momentum, do you think it can be sustained, or it's going to completely depend on the policies and internal directions?
Yeah, it depends on the policies, because obviously you have gained momentum because you've done a few things right, primarily in terms of creating conditions for high demand. But you start, losing headroom as you keep that momentum up. And over the years, you have to keep finding new ways in which you generate new demand. And that requires sustained innovation, sustained policies. And of course, the supply side needs to continue to stay, keep up with it. And as we've seen in the case of Europe, for instance, there was a time when Europe did have very high momentum, and now a lot of that has slowed down. So you have to keep at it, otherwise you will slow down. And that's a natural part of any form of maturation. The more mature you get, you develop arthritis. So in this case, the digitally mature countries have developed digital arthritis, and you have to take proactive steps to avoid that.
Mm. Thank you. And last question. If you could name just one of the most dangerous second order effects of AI that few people are talking about, what would that be?
Well, obviously we have all been worried about, autonomous systems setting off a war that, ends the human race. And, there are lots of people sort of fretting over it. So I won't necessarily mention that. What I do worry about, and we are not talking about it often enough, has to do with the problem of cognitive offloading by children, particularly in middle school. That's where, of course, children's brains are developing all the way, till their 20s. But that's a critical stage where in middle school, where, you are acquiring so many skills that, if these kids become very facile at using AI to do the work for them, they will not develop necessary skills, necessary cognitive functions, necessary social skills, and problem-solving skills. And we will end up with people who are, who don't have intelligence, usable intelligence, even though we have plenty of artificial intelligence. And that's what I worry about the most, cognitive offloading.
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation for me. I appreciate you taking the time.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Lucine, and good luck with the show.
Thank you. If you're ready to make that 1 degree shift towards massive transformation, then hit that subscribe button and join the MetaSelf community because sometimes one idea is all that takes for a breakthrough.